Wetland Board meeting. Protocol requires that I read a few things before we start. The responsibility of this board is to carry out locally the Commonwealth's policy to preserve the wetlands and to accommodate economic activity so as to prevent their depletion. We have 2 members who wish to participate tonight remotely due to COVID-19 concerns. We have a quorum physically present at this meeting tonight. Those of us here must vote to allow those that are not here attending on Zoom to attend the meeting. And this time I'd like to have a motion to allow David Gussman and Robert Lucas to participate remotely.
So moved.
Vote.
All in favor?
Aye. Motion's carried. Now, David, I need you to state where you are right now, and Bob, need you to state where you are right now.
This is David. I'm located in Great Falls, Virginia.
This is Bob Lukens. I'm located in Carborough, North Carolina.
Thank you. Is that satisfactory?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
At this time, we'd like to discuss the minutes. Any corrections, additions, revisions?
Sorry, can we do a brief roll call?
I beg your pardon?
Can we do a roll call?
Sure, absolutely, please.
Okay, Mr. O'Brien? Mr. Roadley? Mr. Apperson?
Here.
Mr. Gussman?
Here.
And Mr. Lukens?
Here.
Thank you.
Any comments on the
No,
minutes?
no additions or corrections, Mr.
Minutes
Chairman.
stand approved as read. Public hearings. The outline for tonight's public hearing will be a staff presentation, followed by any questions or clarifications from the board. Then the public hearing will be opened. At that time, anyone wishing to speak may do so once called upon by the chair. All public speakers must state their name and address for the record, and everybody who wishes to speak have done so. And after everyone who wishes to speak has done so, the public hearing will be closed and discussion among the board will start. At this time, we will begin with the first case presented by Mr. Long.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long, James City County Watershed Planner, here to present WJPA 21-0005. Ms. Carla Havens, Mid-Atlantic Resource Consulting, has applied for a wetlands permit on behalf of Mr. Todd Dellert, Chickahominy Haven Citizens Association, to remove and replace a pier on property located at 3026 North Riverside Drive within the Chickahominy River watershed. There is an existing pier on the property that is beginning to fail. The existing pier is typically underwater during high tide, and is for this reason that the applicant is proposing to remove the existing pier and reconstruct a 160 linear foot pier in place of the existing pier. The proposed pier will impact approximately 90 linear feet of non-vegetated wetlands. The existing pier, demolition, and new pier will be constructed via uplands and barge. While the proposed construction of this pier does not impact vegetated wetlands, it is not intended for private usage and therefore cannot be considered exempt from the local wetlands ordinance. It is for this reason the application appears before the board tonight. As published in the Virginia Register on July 11, 2005, the Revised Wetland Mitigation Compensation Policy and Supplemental Guidelines, Regulation 4 VAC 20390-10, Virginia, as a Chesapeake Bay program partner, is committed to achieve a no net loss of existing wetlands acreage and function in the signatories' regulatory programs. In order for a proposed project to be authorized to impact wetlands and compensate for the wetland loss in some prescribed manner, the following 3 criteria must be met. All reasonable mitigative efforts, including alternative siting, which will eliminate or minimize wetland loss or disturbance, must be incorporated in the proposal. The proposal must be clearly water dependent in nature, and the proposal must demonstrate clearly its need to be in the wetlands and its overwhelming public and private benefits. If the proposed project cannot meet one or more of the above criteria, the project must be denied or must occur in areas outside of the wetlands. Should it satisfy all 3 criteria, however, compensation for that wetland loss is required. The sequence of acceptable mitigation options should be as follows: on-site, off-site within the same watershed, mitigation banks in the same watershed, or a payment of an in lieu fee. If compensation is required, it should be a condition of the permit. Staff has reviewed the application and finds that this project meets the 3 criteria outlined above and that no compensatory mitigation is required. Staff has reviewed the above application and recommends approval of the application as presented. Should the board wish to approve the application, staff suggests the following conditions be incorporated into the approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary local, state, and/or federal permits required for the project. All development activities located in the special flood hazard area shall comply with Article 6, Division 3, floodplain area regulations of the James City County zoning ordinance and receive all required approval and permits prior to the commencement of such activities. The wetland permit for this project shall expire on April 14th, 2025 if construction has not begun, and an extension for this permit, if needed, is written and submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than March 3rd, 2025, 6 weeks prior to the expiration date. I have a brief presentation for you on your screens. Again, the applicant's request is to remove and reconstruct a pier in its location, located at in between 3026 and 3028 North Riverside Drive within the Chickahominy Haven subdivision along the Chickahominy River. Aerial photography of the site, the existing pier that is underwater for the majority of high tide events. Topography as the site is constrained by, it's fairly flat, but again, pier extending into the Chickahominy River. The floodplain as it affects this portion of the property, and a site plan indicating the above proposed construction in yellow. Some site photographs showing the need for the reconstruction of a pier as it is underwater in these photos. And again, staff does recommend approval, given that the applicant obtain all other necessary local, state, and/or federal permits as required for this project, that all development activities located in the special flood hazard area shall comply with Article 6, Division 3, floodplain area regulations of the James City County zoning ordinance, and receive all required approval and permits prior to the commencement of such activities. And this wetland permit become null and void if not started by April 14th, 2025, with a written request for an extension to be submitted to the James City County Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than March 3rd, 2025, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration date. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have at this time.
Hey, David or Bob, do you all have any questions? I want to be sure that you have a chance to speak, but don't forget you. Do you have any
I'm
questions?
sort of curious, is it underwater on high tides just because high tides have risen, or has it just sunk into, into the river?
I believe it's sunk, but I will let the applicant speak further to that matter. While we were out there, it was certainly underwater, but I believe it's because of the construction.
No
Bob, do you have any
questions
questions?
here.
Questions from the board? Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir. At this time, we'd like to open the public hearing for this case. If anyone wishes to speak, please come forward, identify yourself, and we'll listen.
Good afternoon, Mr. Substitute Chairman, members of the board. I'm Carla Havens, 1095 Cherry Rill Lane, Shacklefords, Virginia, 23156. To answer the elevation question of the pier, I think it's a combination of things. It probably was built a little too low and with sea level rise. And I don't know what day the photos were taken, but this week we've had some pretty high tides. So it was put in a number of years ago, and it's just time to replace it. Thank you, Trevor, for the great presentation. I do just want to point out that the T-head, or the L-head at the end, the platform, is going to be minimized from, right now it's 12 by 22, and what's proposed is 12 by 6. So it's a great reduction in the L-head platform, and that's basically to just keep people from hanging out on the end after hours, and it's supposed to be used to ingress and egress from the water to the property and not be a party platform.
Is that a community lot that it's attached to?
Both 52 and 51 are homeowner or Chickahominy Haven Citizens Association property lots. Yes, both of them.
Thank you. Anyone else wishes to speak? If not, we will close the public hearing. And you're,
Chairman, I don't see very many issues with this project. Questions?
are we ready to vote?
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the resolution to grant the permit for Wetlands Board Case WJPA 21-0005 at 3026 and 3028 North Riverside Drive.
Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Rodley?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson? Mr. Gussman?
Yes,
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
The motion carries.
Moving on, case WJPA 21008, presented by Mr. Wilson, Red Oak Landing Pier.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Mike Wilson, Section Chief, Resource Protection, here to present case WJPA 21-0008 at 210 Red Oak Landing. Ms. April Edwards of Virginia Marine Contracting has applied for a wetlands permit on behalf of Mr. Clint Morganson and Ms. Megan Thompson to construct a pier on property located at 210 Red Oak Landing within the Palatin Creek watershed. Applicants are proposing to construct a 5-foot by 230-foot pier with an 11-foot by 10-foot L-head and 5-foot by 11-foot step-down platform. The existing conditions of the property include a tidal marsh, which the applicants propose to cross in order to construct the pier. Construction is proposed to occur from both the uplands and the water. Proposed construction is anticipated to traverse approximately 1,956 square feet of vegetated wetlands with the construction barge. The pier is proposed to be constructed via uplands and the barge. It is not the impacts associated with the pier that are under the board's jurisdiction tonight, but rather the method of construction through the tidal wetland marsh. As published in the Virginia Register on July 11, 2005, the revised wetland mitigation compensation policy and supplemental guidelines, the Virginia is committed to achieve a no net loss of existing wetland acreage and function in the signatories' regulatory programs in order for a proposed project to be authorized to impact wetlands and compensate for the wetland loss in some prescribed manner. The following 3 criteria must be met. All reasonable mitigative efforts, including alternative siting, which would eliminate or minimize wetland loss or disturbance, must be incorporated into the proposal. The proposal must be clearly water dependent in nature, and the proposal must demonstrate clearly its need to be in the wetlands and its overwhelming public and private benefits. If the proposed project cannot meet one or more of the above criteria, the project must be denied or must occur in areas outside of wetlands. Should it satisfy all 3 criteria, however, compensation for the wetland loss is required. The sequence of acceptable mitigation options should be as follows: on-site, off-site within the same watershed, mitigation bank in the same watershed, or payment of an in lieu fee. If compensation is required, it should be a condition of the permit. Staff's reviewed this application and finds that the project does meet the 3 criteria as outlined. It is anticipated that approximately 1,956 square feet of vegetated wetlands may be impacted during the construction of the project. The owner shall replant the impacted area or may purchase credits from an approved tidal wetlands mitigation bank. Staff's reviewed this application and does recommend approval of the application as presented. Should the board wish to approve the application, staff does suggest the following conditions be incorporated into that approval: that the applicant obtain any other necessary local, state, federal permits as required for the project, that all development activities located in the special flood hazard area shall comply with Article 6, Division 3 floodplain area regulations of the James City County zoning ordinance, and receive all required approval and permits prior to the commencement of such activities. That a surety of $15,000 be paid and in place prior to the commencement of work in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office, that a meeting take place no later than 1 year after pier construction is completed to determine the extent of wetland impacts, if any. Staff may invite representatives of other regulatory agencies, the contractor, wetlands board members to this meeting. It will be determined at this meeting if wetland impacts occurred. If there are permanent wetland impacts, the applicant shall purchase from an approved tidal wetlands bank an equal number of square footage credits to offset the unanticipated impacts, or shall replant the area with like vegetation. Once proof of the wetland credits or planting has been provided, the surety shall be returned. If there are no permanent wetland impacts, the surety shall be returned. 5, the wetland permit for this project shall expire April 14th, 2025, if construction has not begun, and that if an extension of the permit is needed, a written request shall be submitted to our division no later than March 3rd, 2025, 6 weeks prior to that expiration date. And I do want to direct your attention to your screen. Their request is to construct a pier on Palatin Creek of approximately 230 feet in length. The subject property at 210 Red Oak Landing is outlined here in blue. And from the aerial map, the area is in question that is titled vegetation is here. Upland bank starts about here. The house was built prior to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance and is grandfathered into the Chesapeake Bay Act, just for your information. Topography as it exists on this site. Again, the toe of the bank or the edge of marsh, depending on which way you think of it, is here. Floodplain as it affects the property. And then from the application, starting at the uplands and then traversing approximately 200 feet of vegetated marsh, and then from the edge of the marsh, projecting out into Palatin Creek proper, approximately 30 feet with a 11 by 20, I think it is, L head here, and then a little 5 by 11 step down platform here to access the creek with canoes and those types of issues. So from the property looking out towards Palatin Creek, the pier is going to start here approximately and cross. What you can see here is just a mud flat, but it is a peltandra marsh. And here in the next month or two, it'll be nice and purple with all the flowers. And then the pier proper will extend out into the creek, approximately where my cursor is. Different perspective, a little further. Pier's going this way. And again, from the other property line, the pier's going like that. And again, it is not the pier construction itself. It is a private single user open pile structure, which is clearly exempt from the Wetlands Board jurisdiction, but it is the manner of construction of the pier that is under the board's purview tonight. Staff, as I said previously, staff does recommend approval with these following conditions: that the applicant obtain any other necessary permits as required, that the development should comply with the floodplain regulations of James City County, that a $15,000 surety be paid to guarantee no net loss of tidal wetland vegetation, that a meeting take place no less than 1 year post-construction to determine if there are any wetland impacts, and then wetlands permit expire 3 years from tonight's date, and then an extension is needed that they request that 6 weeks prior to that expiration date. Be happy to answer any questions the board may have regarding this application.
David, do you have any questions?
No,
Bob?
Yes, just some fill-in information, I guess. Do you have some idea of the estimate of time the construction will take once they get started?
Mr. Lukens, I will defer to the contractor for that question. I do believe he is online as well and can answer that question. Any other questions?
Not for me.
I have one, sir. Do you consider, if this site becomes infested with Phragmites, do you consider that the destruction of the wetlands?
That's a difficult question to answer.
I don't mean to be springing it on you cold like this, but it occurred to me a little while ago that something like a situation like this, I would certainly hope that the staff would think that this is one place where you could eradicate Phragmites if it becomes established. I don't see any Phragmites in the slides anywhere, and you know the problem that you would get into, but this could certainly be something that you could control and get the native vegetation back.
Absolutely. If there, I can almost say for 100% guarantee there are no Phragmites on that property or near that property at the present time.
Good.
So if they were to suddenly appear via the disturbance, you're right, they could be easily
Barge
eradicated.
could bring a seed source in. You know how that works. It could happen. But that would be my only comment to the board and to the staff. And Chuck, I don't know how you feel about that, but if that's okay with you, yeah.
Good observation.
Thank you, sir. At this time, we'll open the public hearings. Anyone in the audience wish to speak to this permit? Okay, I don't see anyone wish to speak to this permit, so we'll close the public hearing and have some discussion.
Hold on, Mr.
Sure.
Apperson, please.
I'm sorry, yeah.
Is the contractor available on Zoom?
Yes. 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Good evening, board members, Chairman, Mr. Wilson. This is Joel, 1588 Windsor Road in Dutton, Virginia. Joel Monasterly stepping in for Abel Edwards with Virginia Marine Contracting. And just to directly, I think, answer one question, the timeline on the project, we're looking at under 30 days. This is something that's extremely sensitive in terms of accessing it. This is sort of unique, looking at the property location and just the best way to access the water in this situation. It's always difficult to point the exact location as well as access through the vegetated wetlands. We initially looked at this by accessing it through the water and uplands as well. And it looks like, just because sometimes it's difficult to, depending on access time when we get there, to actually make the call. So we generally leave a sort of a window how we're going to approach it, but this is something that's pretty specific in terms of impacting the vegetated wetlands. So a couple things to note, the actual impact with the numbers that we have on the drawing, we're not planning on bringing the barge onto the vegetated wetlands. That simply is just not going to work well with the timeline and the amount of impact that's going to potentially occur with this. Our plan at this point is accessing whatever we can from the barge on the waterways as far as we can into the vegetated wetlands. And the next form of action or construction method would be from the uplands using wood mats, which are about 8 to 10 feet wide, and then traversing through that, which would impact, potentially impact about some 93 linear feet going out, and you're looking at 8 to 10 foot wide with these mats, the width of them at least. So you're potentially looking at anywhere from 744 to 930 square feet of impacted vegetated wetlands.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Did that answer your question, Bob?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I mean, Mr. Wilson was farther succinct in his summation. I mean, we don't authorize the pier, but we are authorizing the method of construction. The contractor seems to be aware of those concerns and issues and limitations. And on that basis, I have no issue approving this application.
Good. Motion to adopt the resolution to grant the permit for wetlands.
Oh, excuse me. You gonna say
Public
something,
hearing
sir?
is still open.
Right. I just want to, I think we closed it one time and then started back up, but that's okay. We'll close the public hearing officially. Bob, David, do you have anything
Excuse
you
me,
want to say
Mr.
before we vote?
Apperson.
I'm sorry.
We have another speaker.
I didn't know that. Excuse me. I did not see that. I apologize for that. Please come forward.
Chairman, I'm a bit of a slow comer to the game, but my name is Clint Morgeson, 210 Red Oak Landing, Williamsburg, property owner. I just wanted to actually inquire, based on the contractor's information, about the impacts to the vegetated wetlands, if that would remain true to the information presented by Mr. Wilson.
So if you could help me with your question again.
Yes, sir. Excuse me. The information presented by the contractor, Joel, indicated less impacts to the vegetated wetlands and a method of construction accessed by the upland side, not bringing the barge into the marsh. I'm just curious, and sorry to bring this up during the meeting, but if that affects the presented information by Mr. Wilson.
Mr. Rodley, I believe specifically the surety amount.
So
I think you may be concerned about whether the barge is going to be used or not, or whether the mats are going to be more harmful in the wetlands than the barge. I think, is that your question?
Correct, sir.
Michael, do you want to address that?
From the contractor's discussion, it appears that the impacts will be about half of what staff anticipated. If the board wanted to reduce the surety by half, staff would find that acceptable.
I believe that the specific question, though, here is in the method of construction proposed, is there a reasonable assurance that the damage to the wetland will be such that it will, in fact, restore itself, if I'm paraphrasing?
I will go so far to say both are correct in my ineloquent phrasing.
Mr. Rodley, that's why we want to look at it in a year.
So I can't speak to this project in terms of the actual impact, as Mr. Wilson stated, but in general, matting is an effective way to disperse the weight of construction equipment with minimal impact. Now, these are, it's Pelatandra, it is still silty area, so I can understand why Mr. Wilson wants to come back after a year to make sure that those areas have returned to the proper elevation, and Pelatandra is coming back.
And you're the property owner,
Correct.
so this is your project.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Anyone else wish to speak, please? At this time, we'll close the public hearing.
Now?
Well, I'm concerned is I would not like to see Phragmites get a toehold in Powhatan Creek. And I feel that a project like this, it can be controlled very easily. And I'm sure Michael will be taking care of that, watching for that. I prefer to vote for this. Do you have a motion?
Sure. A motion to adopt the resolution to grant the permit for Wetlands Board Case WJPA 21-0008 at 210 Red Oak Landing.
Okay. Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Rodley?
yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Gussman?
Yes,
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
The motion carries.
Okay, permit's been granted. Board considerations is next on the agenda. And as a special privilege, going to adjourn the wetlands meeting, and now I think we're going to have a call for a volunteer to chair the Chesapeake Bay Board from the staff.
I volunteer, so
Very good. Thank you, sir. Here's your gavel.
got one here, thank you.
Okay.
So I will call to order the James City County Chesapeake Bay Board for tonight, Wednesday, April 14th. It is the responsibility of this board to carry out locally the Commonwealth policy to protect against and minimize pollution and deposition of sediments in wetlands, streams, lakes in James City County, which are tributaries to the Chesapeake Bay. We have 2 members that wish to participate remotely due to COVID-19 concerns, and we have a quorum physically present at this meeting tonight. Those present must vote to allow each member to participate remotely. May I have a motion to allow David Gussman and Robert Lukens to participate remotely?
Chairman, I make a motion, we allow them to participate remotely.
All in favor?
Aye. Roll call, Ms. Farman?
Mr. O'Brien?
Here.
Here.
Mr. Gussman?
Here,
Can you tell us where you're participating from, Mr. Gussman?
Great Falls, Virginia.
All right, thank you, sir. And Mr. Lukens?
Yes, here, I'm participating from Carrboro, North Carolina.
All right, thank you, sir.
You have the minutes before you from the February 10th and March 22nd work session. Any corrections or additions? Minutes stand approved. Public hearings. The outline for tonight's public hearings will be a staff presentation followed by any questions or clarifications from the board, and then the public hearing will be opened. At that time, anybody wishing to speak may do so. Once called upon by the chair, all public speakers must state their name and address for the record. After everyone wishing to speak have done so, the public hearing will be closed and discussion among the board will start. First case is CBPA 21-0017 at 10025 Sycamore Landing Road. Mr. Wilson.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Mike Wilson here, Section Chief for Resource Protection, here to present case number CBPA 21-0017, Mr. Jeffrey Miller at 10025 Sycamore Landing Road. This case first appeared before the board in 2019. The board approved the application as I will describe. The application expired. Mr. Miller went to get his building permit, realized it had expired, and that is why it's back before the board. Mr. Miller has applied for Chesapeake Bay exception for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the construction of a detached garage on property located at 10025 Sycamore Landing Road within the Sycamore Landing subdivision and the Ware Creek watershed. Total lot size of this property is 1.23 acres, of which 40% is located within the RPA. The applicant has proposed the construction of detached garage equaling 2,080 square feet, of which approximately 250 square feet impact the RPA. The proposed garage will be constructed out of two Connex box containers adjoined by a roof, and which will also serve as storage for the existing house and the shed which will be removed from the property. Due to the natural grade of the property, the garage will be elevated by rear supports and a gabion wall and a gabion retaining wall. The remainder of the area underneath the Connex boxes will be gravelled. This amount of impact equals one planting unit to which the applicant has provided. The applicant has provided plans for a vegetated swale and irrigation infiltration trench to offset runoff from the impervious impacts of the garage. Applicant has submitted an erosion sediment control plan and a land disturbing permit and posted a surety for the mitigation required for the proposal. Staff's evaluated this application and the exception request for the construction of the detached garage and finds that the application does meet the conditions as outlined in sections 2311 and 2314, and that the application should be heard before the board because the garage is considered accessory. Therefore, the request must be considered by the board following this public hearing. Consideration by the board may grant exceptions to sections 23.7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting this exception request will not confer upon the applicants any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code, to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels, and reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and the exception request and has determined the impacts associated with this proposal to be minor for the proposed development. Staff does recommend approval for this exception. However, should the board approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into that approval. The applicant obtain any other necessary local, federal, state permits, including an erosion sediment control plan and a land disturbing permit. The infiltration best management practice will follow the standards and specifications found in the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality Stormwater Specification Number 8, Infiltration, current version. That the exception request shall become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14th, 2022, and written requests for an extension be submitted to our office no later than 6 weeks prior to that expiration date, which is March 3rd, 2022. I'll direct your attention to your screen. His request is to construct a detached garage within the Sycamore Landing subdivision at 10025 Sycamore Landing Road, shown here in blue, York River, right here. Aerial photograph of the property showing an existing shed structure here that will be removed. The topography of the site from the road climbs steeply up to the house location here. Flat backyard, septic system, septic fields are in the backyard here. And then the property drops back off down to the wetlands and RPA in the rear of the property. The RPA is shown here is in purple. And from the application, the site plan, the original shed is shown here in red, completely outside the RPA. The proposed garage shown here with this little bit of yellow impacting the RPA. Drain fields for the house are here, shown in blue, and then a new gravel driveway extension to reach the proposed garage. From the application, a couple of cross sections, elevation from the north side, showing the proposed gabion walls and how they would work with holding up the structure. The roof structure would be constructed, and then this would be the shipping container or Connex box here, and then there would be a covered entryway in the front here. The driveway would be accessed through this way, and then from the other side, the gabion wall here. This is the area of gravel here and here that was mentioned previously. And then from another plan view section, the roof line would capture, or an infiltration trench at the ground level of the roof line would capture all the runoff coming from the rooftop. Existing shed from the property, which will be demolished. Typical, and all the material that you see on the ground and within the shed would be stored inside the proposed new garage. Staff does recommend approval, and we note that the impacts are minor. We do request these following permit conditions. Any other federal, state, and local permits, including an erosion sediment control plan and land disturbing permit. Submit a design for the proposed infiltration that does meet the Virginia Stormwater BMP Clearinghouse Design Specification Number 8 infiltration. that the request become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14, 2022, and that requests for extension occur no later than 6 weeks prior to that expiration, March 3rd, 2022. Be happy to answer any questions the board may have regarding this application.
Any questions for staff? Mr. Lukens? Mr. Gussman?
No,
No.
None, sir.
Hearing none, we will open the public hearing. Does anyone wish to address the board on this matter?
My name is Jeffrey Miller. I am the owner, builder, contractor, designer, et cetera, et cetera.
You state your address for the
Oh, I'm
record.
sorry. Jeffrey Miller, 10025 Sycamore Landing Road. Hearing me again, I want to offer apologies to the board. Crazy year.
Yeah.
Projects. My son lives right next door. He has a new room addition on his house, and a new addition to his family, and another one on the way. That kind of took precedent, so
Good.
I appreciate your indulgence. Hope everything will go better
Would
this
the
time.
year that Mr. Wilson has suggested in the permit or in his presentation give you sufficient time to start construction?
I believe so.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No. Anyone else wish to speak on this matter? Hearing none, I will close the public hearing. Matter is before the board.
I would like to make a motion to adopt, Mr. Chairman, CBAP 210017, Sycamore Landing Road.
You have a motion to adopt. Can I have a roll call, please?
Mr. O'Brien?
Aye.
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Gussman?
yes,
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Motion carried. The matter is approved. Thank you for coming out tonight. The next item on the agenda is CBPA 21-0036 at 103 Seven Oaks. Mr. Long.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long here present CBPA 21-0036. Miss Peggy Kropf of Heart's Ease Landscaping has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of Miss Peggy Marcelli for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the construction of 2 retaining walls and a patio on property located at 104 Seven Oaks within the Fords Colony subdivision in the Palatin Creek watershed. Parcel was platted in 1997 before the changes to the Chesapeake Bay Ordinance in 2004, which did affect this property. Total lot size of this property is 0.38 acres, of which 61% is located within the RPA. The applicant is proposing 2 retaining walls, equating to a total of 80 square feet of impervious impacts to the RPA. The rear of the yard is beginning to experience signs of rill erosion, and ease of access has also been a concern expressed by the applicant. It is for this reason the applicant is proposing the 2 retaining walls associated with this exception request. The applicant is also proposing to construct a 256 square foot patio. Total impervious area associated with the proposed construction equates to approximately 336 square feet of impacts to the RPA. Required mitigation for this amount of proposed impacts equates to the plantings of 1 canopy tree, 2 understory trees, and 3 shrubs. The applicant has proposed an excess of native riparian plantings on the planting plan submitted to this division. Staff has evaluated the application and exception request for the construction of the 2 retaining walls and patio. The application meets the ordinance conditions in sections 23-11 and 23-14 and should be heard by the board because the retaining walls and patio are considered accessory in nature. The board may grant exceptions to sections 23-7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting the exception will not confer upon the applicants any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code, to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels. and that reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and exception request and has determined the impacts associated with the proposal to be minor for the proposed development. Staff does recommend approval for the exception request, and if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into its approval. That the applicant must obtain all other necessary federal, state, and local permits as required for the project. That a surety of $250 be submitted in a form acceptable to James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the mitigation plantings. And this exception request approval shall become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14th, 2022, with written requests for an extension to this exception be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than March 3rd, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to its expiration date. A brief presentation on your screens above. Again, applicant Peggy Marcelli at 104 Seven Oaks has requested to construct a patio and 2 retaining walls. The vicinity map above showing the parcel here in blue within the Fords Colony subdivision. An aerial photograph of the parcel and the project location, the 2 retaining walls approximately here, and the patio closer towards the house. This is the pond with the resource on it. Topography of the lot does slope back down towards the resource and does get steeper towards the rear of the property. Sanitary sewer that does run adjacent to the property lines. And the resource protection area as it affects this property, encompassing the majority of the house existing. Site plan that has been submitted to this department, the resource protection area outlined here in red. The proposed retaining walls here with the pond just adjacent to them, and the proposed patio circling it. Some site photographs, the area of the approximate patio construction. Looking down towards the resource and the area of the 2 retaining walls. As you can see, there is some erosion starting to occur in this general vicinity here. And looking back towards the other property on the other side of the home. Again, staff does recommend approval of this exception request, given that all other necessary local, state, and federal permits are acquired as necessary. That a surety of $250 be submitted to guarantee the mitigation plantings, and this exception request approval become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14th, 2022, with written request for an extension submitted no later than March 3rd, 2022, 6 weeks prior to the expiration date of this exception request. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions the board may have at this time.
Any questions of staff?
Just a quick one. You said 2 retaining walls.
Yes, sir.
So like they're parallel to one another?
Yes, they will be parallel. They basically just step down the topography. The first one,
Like each a foot? What's the step down?
I am not positive of the elevation change, but I will defer that question to the applicant.
Mr. Long, can you show us on the photograph again where those walls will be located?
Yes. Aerial photography?
That right here, the ground shots, there you go.
Oh, sure. Oops, sorry. They'll be approximately in this vicinity and then sloping up towards the top of that bank.
You mentioned that there's real erosion in this area?
There is a little bit of real erosion. The photos don't entirely capture it, but they do follow some of the grass patch lines that you can see in the photos. There's some on this side as well where there is no grass growing.
This lot was platted before the Ches Bay Act?
Yes, sir, before the revisions that affected the Fords Colony subdivision.
This is a best management practice to BMP to the right, the pond?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Gussman, Mr. Lukens, do you have any questions for staff?
No,
No questions.
Very
Thank you very
good.
much.
Thank you. We will open the public hearing. Would the applicant like to address the board?
I'll speak if that's permissible. I'm Peggy Kropp with Heartsease Landscape and Garden Design. My office is at 7884 Richmond Road in Towano. And I've been working with Mr. and Mrs. Marsili since last fall on this project. They had recently purchased the home. It's at the end of a cul-de-sac, and so everything slopes down toward the pond in the rear. They have some issues on both sides of the property. On the right side with a Ford's Colony drainage easement that runs into some existing riprap that was shown on the site plan on the right. And then on the left-hand side, a few years ago, a new house was built on a point even out further, and that creates a lot of drainage also onto their property. So to help mitigate that, what we were planning to do was fill the left rear side of the property, which is now just a few trees. We're going to fill that with native trees and shrubs and perennials to help absorb a lot of the water there. The yard itself, because of the slope, is not easy to use. And as you get closer to the water, it's more of a slope and it's muddy. And so the Marsilis would like to be able to level the yard a little bit more. And we decided the idea of putting in 2 parallel retaining walls. Each one would be 24 to 30 inches in height, with some stone steps in between that takes them closer to the pond, because Mr. Marsili would love to be able to take his grandchildren down there to fish. So he'd like to be able to get as close as he can. We're certainly going to mitigate those dry stacked stone walls. We're using big oversized stone. Water will slowly perk through there, but we'll have buffers of native grasses and native perennials in between the walls. And then along the edge of the pond, there's an existing buffer of native plants that will remain. So we're filling in with a lot of plants on that side. We're using some other natives on the right side where it's quite wet, some native grasses and perennials. And then in the center of the yard, they'd love to put a patio. They entertain their family quite often and would love to have a patio. We designed a circular 18-foot diameter patio with stone seating walls on both sides and a small accessible stone pathway to get to and from the house. And then there'll be several large stone steps coming off the patio down into the yard to meet up with the stone steps that go between the 2 retaining walls. There'll be a small amount of grass in the backyard that remains, but it will be more level, so it's more accessible for the family to use.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the board? Is there anyone else that would care to address the board? Hearing none, I will close the public hearing. Discussion?
Pretty straightforward to me, Mr. Chairman.
You know, we have these cases where where lots are experiencing erosion, particularly lots platted before the Chesapeake Bay ordinance. I won't say that it doesn't appear that the erosion is substantial here, but I can appreciate the desire to contain that and to be able to make use of that area. So I will entertain a motion.
Take a motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception for Chesapeake Bay Board case CBPA 21-0036 at 104 Seven Oaks.
We have a motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception request.
Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Gussman?
Yes.
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Very good. Next case, CBPA 0044 at 9209 Candlelight Court. Mr. Long.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long, here represents CBPA 21-0044. Ms. Catherine Gallagher, River Pools and Spas, has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of Ms. Amber Gilliam for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the construction of a pool on property located at 9209 Candlelight Court within the Retreat subdivision and the Diaskin Creek watershed. Parcel was platted in 2002 before the changes to the Chesapeake Bay Ordinance in 2004, which affect this lot. Total lot size of this property is 3.88 acres, of which 90% is located within the RPA. The applicant is proposing to construct a pool equating to a total of 626 square feet of impervious impacts to the landward 50-foot RPA. While a portion of the existing yard is outside the RPA, the applicant has expressed that moving the pool to this location would impact the drain field as it has been platted and constructed on this lot. It is for this reason that the applicant has proposed the pool in its current location. Mitigation requirements for this amount of impervious cover equates to 2 canopy trees, 4 understory trees, and 6 shrubs. Staff has evaluated the application and exception requests for the construction of a pool. This application meets the ordinance conditions in sections 23-11 and 23-14 and should be heard by the board because the pool is considered accessory in nature. The board may grant exceptions to section 23-7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting the exception will not confer upon the applicants any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code, to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels. Reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and exception request and has determined the impacts associated with the proposal to be minor for the proposed development. Staff does recommend approval for the exception request, and if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into the approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary federal, state, and local permits as required for this project, including the submission of an erosion and sediment control plan, a land disturbing permit, and a surety. A mitigation plan consisting of 2 canopy trees, 4 understory trees, and 6 shrubs be submitted to the James City County Stormwater Division prior to the issuance of the land disturbing permit. That a surety of $500 be submitted in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the mitigation plantings, and that this exception request approval become null and void if construction has not begun by April 14th, 2022, with written requests for an extension to this exception be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than March 3rd, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration date. Again, the applicant request, given the presentation above, is to construct a pool on property located at 9209 Candlelight Court within the Retreat subdivision and the Diaskin Creek watershed, parcel outlined here in light blue and shown in the aerial photography above. Topography as it affects this site, it is heavily constrained by steeper slopes and does have a small island of a flat area towards the middle. The resource protection area as it affects this property, outlined here in green and orange, the area outside of the RPA coming up through the middle of the house. And a site plan showing the proposed construction of a pool. The red line indicating the 100-foot resource protection area, and the area in yellow showing the portion of the project that will impact the RPA. Some site photographs showing the general proximity and area of the proposed construction. And staff does recommend approval of this application request, given that all other necessary local, state, and federal permits are required including an erosion sediment control plan, a land disturbing permit, and a surety. That a mitigation plan consisting of 2 canopy trees, 4 understory trees, and 6 shrubs be submitted to this office. That a surety of $500 to guarantee the mitigation plan is also submitted. And that this exception request approval become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14th, 2022, with written request for an extension submitted no later than March 3rd, 2022, 6 weeks prior to the expiration date of this approval. Thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the board may have at this time.
Mr. Long, is the encroachment outside of the footprint of the pool, is that pavers, patio, what is that?
It's my understanding that they will be patio.
Concrete?
Yes, though I will defer that question to the applicant to further answer.
So the pool up there is that peanut-looking shaped?
Yes, it is this shape here, with everything else around it being the patio area.
Everything is within the yard, is that correct?
It is all within the yard, yes, sir.
Okay.
Hear from the applicant on how permeable the patio is or not?
Yes, sir. I believe the applicant is in attendance today.
Is there any means proposed to control runoff, or?
At this time, none has been submitted.
Mr. Gussman, Mr. Lukens, any questions for staff?
None.
None for me, thank you.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to open the public hearing. Would the applicant like to address the board? Please state your name and address for the record.
I'm Amber Gillum. I live at 9209 Candlelight Court. We are planning on doing concrete for the patio area. We could possibly do pavers if that's something you'd prefer us to. And it's a fiberglass pool, so you don't drain the pool. There's no backwash. Going to be doing a mineral pool. Be a cartridge filtration system, so there'll be no backwashing the system or anything like that.
Appreciate that explanation. The concern that we have for the rather large area of impervious in the RPA buffer is creating an opportunity for additional runoff, either erosion or point source concentration. So one means to address that would be, if the property is conducive, some form of infiltration to help minimize that runoff and help absorb some of those nutrients, or some type of infiltration paver system. So I'm not going to dictate which one to you, but something to think about.
Yes, the top parts you see there are retaining walls, and we do plan on putting a lot of native plants in there. So it'll be better than what's there now, which is just Bermuda grass. But you mean the backside of the pool area? So some kind of gravel or?
I mean, and it's up to you. You don't have to make a decision here on the spot,
okay.
But it's just a lot of impervious area within the RPA, you know.
Probably primarily around the that large area around the pool.
Mm. Okay.
If that's all cement, that's I can see the retaining walls closer to the house. Probably okay.
If you'd like some time to think about this, that you have the option of deferring the matter tonight so that you can think through this, perhaps with staff. It's up to you. We can act on it tonight, or you can choose to defer if you are inclined.
We can just act on it tonight, it's fine.
Mr. Chair, I do want to, before any decisions are made on infiltration or materials, do want to note that their drain field for the property is within 20 feet of the pool. And I don't know if infiltration adjacent to a drain field like that would be permittable by the health department. You can see it's at the bottom right corner of the slide. You can see in pink the word field.
Oh, I misunderstood. I thought it was to the left where it says septic, but
That is the septic tank. So I just wanted to point that feature out to you. That may impact your desire to have infiltration up by the pool.
Those are two septic fields, or what is that?
That's the tank where you see the circle there.
Yeah.
And it runs down, it's kind of a hill there. It runs down to the back area, and the field's going across the back area. That's the first line of 5 that you see. The other 4 are behind that pink dotted line there.
thank you very much. Are there any other questions of the applicant?
Thank you.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to speak on this case? Hearing none, we'll close the public hearing. Open for board discussion. I can appreciate Mr. Wilson's comment about the potential implications of infiltration next to a drain field. Still think this is a lot of impervious in the buffer. I would have appreciated that been addressed more directly in the application, just throwing it out there.
Comments well taken, sir. And I also share the view that it would have been good to have some infiltration there, but that the drain field, I think, pretty much negates anything we could do there. So I'm prepared to vote for this, sir.
Mr. Gussman, Mr. Lukens, any comments?
No.
No comment.
All right, I'm open for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that the board vote to adopt CBE 21-0044, Candlelight Court Pool.
We have a motion on the floor to adopt the resolution to grant the exception.
Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Roadley?
No.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Gussman?
Yes.
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Very good. Next case, CBPA 21-0045 at 4055 South Riverside Drive.
Afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long here presents CBPA 21-0045. Mr. Chase Grogg of Landtech Resources, Inc. has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of Mr. Charles and Ms. Catherine Woolham for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the construction of a house addition on property located at 4055 South Riverside Drive within the Chickahominy Haven subdivision and the Yarmouth Creek watershed. Parcel was platted in 1961 prior to the adoption of the Chesapeake Bay Ordinance in 1990. Total lot size of this property is 0.34 acres, of which 44% is located within the RPA. The existing impervious cover within the RPA equates to 2,165 square feet. The applicants are proposing to expand the footprint of the existing house to equate to 2,500 square feet of impact within the RPA. The majority of the expansion of the house will cover existing gravel that surrounds portions of the dwelling. Therefore, new impervious cover within the RPA equates to an increase of 335 square feet of impacts. The applicants are also proposing to remove 2 trees within the RPA associated with the proposed expansion. Required mitigation for this amount of impervious impacts to the RPA equates to the plantings of 1 canopy tree, 2 understory trees, and 3 shrubs. The applicants propose the plantings of 22 shrubs, hereby exceeding county mitigation requirements. Staff has evaluated the application and exception requests for the construction of a house expansion. This application meets the ordinance conditions in sections 23-11 and 23-14 and should be heard by the board because the construction is an expansion of an existing structure within the RPA. Board may grant exceptions to Section 23-7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting the exception will not confer upon the applicants any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-imposed or self-created, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels. Reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and exception request and has determined the impacts associated with the proposal to be minor for the proposed development. Staff does recommend approval for this exception request, and if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into its approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary federal, state, and local permits as required for the project, including the submission of an erosion sediment control plan, a land disturbing permit with a surety if required. A surety of $250 be submitted in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the mitigation plantings. And this exception request approval become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14th, 2022, with written requests for an extension submitted no later than March 3rd, 2022, 6 weeks prior to its expiration date. Brief presentation above. Again, the applicant request is to construct a house addition on property located at 4055 South Riverside Drive, outlined here in blue within the Chickahominy Haven subdivision. Aerial photography showing the house in question and the area for the expansion.
Expansion is side of the house?
It's yes, yes, sir. It's going to be on the sides, both sides of the house, and on the front of the house, facing towards the road. So it'll go outwards and forwards.
Nothing towards the river.
That's correct, yes, sir. Nothing towards the river, all outwards and forwards towards the road. The floodplain, as it does affect this property, heavily constrained. And the resource protection area affecting this lot, the majority of the lot does, or half the lot does get encapsulated by the RPA. There should be a site plan, but it seems to have been removed. In the right-hand corner, site plan showing there is an increase of impervious area on the sides of the house and coming towards the road. Some photos from the site showing the area of increased impervious area and the gravel of which the majority of the expansion is covering. The other side of the house, which also will have an increase and an expansion. And the front of the house, which is proposed or is included in this proposal. Again, staff does recommend approval of this application request, given that all other necessary local, state, and federal permits are required as they are that necessary. That a surety of $250 be submitted to this division to guarantee the mitigation plantings. And this exception request become null and void if construction is not begun by April 14th, 2022, with written requests for an extension submitted no later than March 3rd, 2022, 6 weeks prior to its expiration date. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have at this time.
What are the guaranteed plantings?
The required plantings for this would be 1 canopy tree, 2 understory trees, and 3 shrubs. The applicants have, however, expressed and put on a plan to submit and plant 22 shrubs, which is double the required plantings.
Sorry. Mr. Lukens, Mr. Gussman, any questions for staff?
No.
No questions.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Would the applicant care to address the board?
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. My name is Kathy Woolham, and that's my husband who was supposed to come up with me. We currently reside on 121 Tayside, Williamsburg, Virginia. This cottage was constructed in the 1960s, and the indoor space, thank you, is about the size of the platform that you're standing on, or sitting on. And so we have a growing family and would really like to have the space to enjoy the Chickahominy River as we do. The grass area you saw has gravel. That used to be a gravel drive, and so the grass is kind of covering it now, but most of that area is gravel. And we cannot build towards the road where you see that left-hand window, because that is our drain field and septic tank is right there. So we are looking to expand sideways, just to have an extra living space and a bedroom, and then have a garage for the toys on the to the right there.
Just curious, are you elevating the living structure or are you keeping it at grade?
I mean, the new expansion.
Yes.
It's on a what do you call it? Slab, thank you, now. And we are not at that point yet to know what's recommended to elevate it or not. It is actually not in the flood zone, I think, because we're very fortunate that this is one of two lots that has never flooded in the Haven. If you drive down the street, then you'll see flooding, but this has never had flooding.
These are one of the original three houses in the Haven. They're all lined up. They're all on higher ground than anywhere else.
Fortunate.
The water's never gotten even in the front yard.
So the picture you had where it was showing green versus blue, they're in the green.
Yes, Mr. O'Brien, I can explain that floodplain picture to you. The green is X-shaded zone, which we don't regulate. The Woolhams are correct. They are outside of the floodplain. They do not have to meet minimum freeboard requirements, although it is a discussion staff is going to have with them at some point just for a safety factor, but they are not required to elevate their structure.
So, since I didn't see a site plan in the presentation other than that small view. Just if you could verbally describe, you're going to go sideways on either side of the house, 5-10 feet.
I brought it with me. It is. Because I think it's 16 feet if you're facing the river, 16 feet to the left, 8 feet to the right.
Okay. And then, but the majority of the encroachment is on the street side of the home.
We're gonna go up.
Oh, up.
No, when you say encroachment, you mean in the RPA?
Yeah.
It's to the left is the majority, because the entire cottage is in the RPA.
Yeah.
So that kind of makes it a challenge. Oh, thank you.
A little difficult to read.
Know the history of the property, who built the house?
Excuse me?
You know who built the house? I know about the property.
Ruggles?
I was there when the bullets was put in and everything.
Ruggles?
You're right, it's the fact that it does not flood. You're absolutely positively right, and it's the highest point there is in the whole subdivision there until it lets you come around on Richmond Drive on the other side. On that side of the river, that's the highest point there is.
I think there were two, from what we understand, there were two NASA scientists that went in way back when and plotted out the land, and the one next to us and ours.
I think Mr. Apperson's in the know. I think he knows.
Oh, good.
The development was put in by a now deceased game warden.
Oh, really?
What the property used to be called Jones's. and there was a peach orchard there years ago. The whole farm was a peach orchard. That was an old farm at one time, a field. Getting a little bit off the scale, but it looks like we're waiting to hear something, so I wanted to fill in the
Well,
time
thank you.
here.
That's good to know.
So the question was going to be answered about the
I appreciate
size of the
staff
house.
preparing the site plan so that we could actually read it.
Mr. Roadley, members of the board, the addition here, this distance here is a little over 17 feet addition here, and it's a little over 16 feet here. So the house must be a little skewed. And then on the other side, it's 7-foot addition. And then going out towards the street, that I believe that distance there is 41 feet for the garage. The driveway would come in like that. And this part here is outside of the RPA, outside of your jurisdiction.
Very good. Any other questions of the applicant? Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody else care to address this project? Hearing none, I will close the public hearing. The matter is before the board.
Was it?
Good.
Do I have a motion?
Motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception for Chesapeake Bay Board case CBAPA 21-0045 at 4055 South Riverside Drive.
We have a motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception.
Yes, Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson? Mr. Gussman?
Yes.
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
The motion carries.
Thank you. Next case is CBPA 21-0047 at 208 monofief, single-family dwelling and deck. Mr. Wilson.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Mike Wilson here, Resource Protection Section Chief, here to present case CBPA 21-0047 from Omega Development at 208 Monofief in the Fords Colony subdivision. Mr. Matthew Roth of Roth Environmental has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of Mr. Marty Mather, Omega Development, for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the construction of a new single-family dwelling and deck on property located at 208 Monofief within the Fords Colony subdivision and Palatin Creek watershed. The property is further identified as James City County Tax Map Parcel 37108-00085. Parcel was platted in 2001 before the changes to the Chesapeake Bay Ordinance took effect in 2004. Total lot size for this property is 0.51 acres, of which 95% is within the RPA. The applicant is proposing to construct a new single-family dwelling with a deck equaling 4,831 square feet of impacts, of which 3,224 square feet are proposed within the landward 50-foot RPA, and 1,009 square feet are proposed within the seaward 50-foot RPA. Total impervious impacts equal 4,233 square feet. The entirety of the proposed deck is also located within the seaward 50-foot RPA. Due to the configuration of the lot and the RPA impacts associated from the changes to the ordinance in 2004, there's no room outside of the RPA to construct the house. It's for this reason that the proposed construction impacts the RPA, and the fact that the seaward 50-foot RPA is impacted is the reason that this matter is before the board. Required mitigation for the amount of impervious cover equals the planting of 10 canopy trees, 20 understory trees, and 30 shrubs. The applicant has proposed the planting of 4 canopy trees, 6 understory trees, and 104 shrubs, and over 2,000 square feet of mulch. Applicant is also proposing to construct 2 bioretention BMPs in order to capture runoff from the proposed house. Therefore, the proposed mitigation for the amount of impervious impacts exceeds the county mitigation requirements because of the BMPs. Staff's evaluated the application and the exception request for the construction of the single-family dwelling and deck. The application does meet the ordinance requirements in sections 2311 and 2314 and should be heard before the board because the deck is considered accessory and the proposed dwelling extends into the seaward 50-foot RPA. The board may grant exceptions to sections 23(7) if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. That granting the exception will not confer upon the applicant any special privileges denied by Chapter 23 of the James City County Code to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. That the exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances which are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels, and that reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff's reviewed the application and the exception request and has determined that the impacts associated for this proposal to be major for the proposed development. Staff does recommend approval for the exception request. However, if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into that approval. That the applicant obtain any other necessary federal, state, and local permits as required. The bioretention BMPs will follow the standards and specifications found in the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality, Stormwater Specification Number 9, Bioretention, the current version. All plantings required for the bioretention BMPs shall not count towards the required plantings. That a surety of $5,000 be submitted in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the planting mitigation and the bioretention installation. That the submission of a bioretention as-built, that the exception request approval become null and void if construction has not begun by April 14, 2022, and written requests for an extension shall be submitted to our division no later than March 3rd, 2022, 6 weeks prior to the expiration date. And if you would direct your attention to your screen, their request is to construct a single-family dwelling and deck at 208 Monofief within the Palatin Creek watershed and the Ford's Colony subdivision. It is outlined here in blue on this vicinity map. From the aerial photograph of the property, the site is currently wooded. Topography of the site, it slopes from the cul-de-sac down to the rear of the property. Fairly consistently and fairly significantly. Sanitary sewer, as it is available for this property, it does run along the side of the property in a JCSA easement. RPAs it affects this property, shown here in gold, affects from about a quarter of the way into the property all the way to the rear of the property. From the site plan, Mr. Roth did do a wetland delineation of the property. That confirmed wetland line is shown here, highlighted in blue. That line was offset 50 feet to here, and then an additional 50 feet to get the 100-foot buffer. The reason I make that distinction is because of when the lot was platted, any impacts in the seaward 50-foot buffer here for the principal structure must be approved by the Chesapeake Bay Board. The total impacts to the RPA are shown here in yellow. Approximately 1,000 of those impacts are here within the seaward 50-foot RPA, and 3,200 square feet of impacts would be in the landward 50-foot RPA. Also shown here are in green are the two stormwater BMPs they are proposing. They're bioretention. They will infiltrate water. They also have a underdrain system in place just in case due to high groundwater, seasonal high groundwater that might occur on the property as evidenced by the wetland system. And then the outfall for those underdrains would be here, right at the head of this wetland system. The planting plan that was provided, some foundation plantings here, and then a large swath of trees and shrubs here, and some more trees and shrubs in the back. Again, I want to reiterate all the plantings that would happen in the bioretention plan, BMPs here and here, are not shown on this mitigation plan. They are required to be planted per the specification from DEQ, and we won't allow double counting. A couple site photographs from the cul-de-sac looking into the lot. From the rear of the lot near the JCSA sanitary sewer easement looking up into, I'm sorry, this is at the front of the lot near the sanitary sewer easement looking into the lot. And then from the opposing side looking up into the lot. You can see the significant topo here that this lot has. And then the BMP outfall would be in this general area here, and with this being the wetland system. Again, looking up into the lot from the wetland system, one of the stormwater bioretention basins would be in this area, and then outfalling over into this area. Again, staff recommends approval. Do want to note that the impacts for this project are major, and we do recommend approval with these conditions, that any other necessary local, federal, state permits are required, that the bioretention BMPs follow the standard and spec outlined in the DEQ manual, specification number 9, that a surety of $5,000 be submitted to guarantee the mitigation plantings and the BMP installation, submission of the bioretention BMP as-built, and that the request be null and void if construction is not begun 1 year from tonight, April 14th, 2022, and written request for an extension be submitted no later than 6 weeks prior to that expiration date, March 3rd, 2022. I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have regarding this application.
Questions for staff?
Staff recommends, I assume you've put a lot of time into studying the mitigation, the retention ponds, the wetlands, everything.
Yeah,
It all meets your
yes,
approval.
sir. And one thing that I can I want to point out that didn't make it into the formal staff report was the applicant has supplied a Virginia runoff reduction method worksheet. What that means for you gentlemen is that they have shown that those 2 BMPs will reduce the nutrient loads coming off of the project to pre-development or better loading. So what
something new,
in
isn't it?
effect, what they're guaranteeing is that this project has either no net effect or a net benefit.
That's a new feature though, right?
That is
first I've heard you mention that.
They have supplied it in the past, and we've been remiss in mentioning it to the board. It is not often that we get one of those spreadsheets on a project like this.
Did you walk this property?
I have not. Mr. Long did.
Actually, I think I've walked it too, back when I was looking for property. But, and you might not know the answer to this, and the applicant might. The building envelope is over here on the, I guess, the right-hand side.
Yeah.
Was that sometimes when you plat these things, they recommend building envelopes. Was that the recommended building envelope? Or was there not one? Because I would think that off to the left would be less invasive to the.
I'll let Mr. Roth address that, but the setbacks are shown here. They're 10-foot side setbacks here and here, and I believe from the cul-de-sac it is 30 feet, 30-foot offset from the cul-de-sac, and you can see that line right here. But I will let Mr. Roth address that.
Mr. Wilson, is there an O&M plan that goes along with these BMPs? Operations and maintenance plan?
No, we did not require that.
Thank you.
I
Mr.
have
Gussman, Mr. Lukens, any questions for staff?
None from me.
Yes, I have, looking for a little information. The road access, as far as I can see from the site plan, I didn't bring up any additional contours or anything like that, but it appears that this may be a low, I don't know if it's a low area in the roadway. I note the site plan notes a couple catch basins on the upper side of the property. And I'm wondering about the capacity of these catch basins and whether under severe storm conditions, we would have additional flood from the uphill side, and whether that's taken into account in the planning.
We can ask the applicant that question. So your question was specific to the two BMPs that are shown on the screen?
The actual, the catch basins noted that are in place, I assume on the roadway where it says
He's
back
talking
of
the roadway inlets.
Oh.
Yes, on the inland side. And I'm just somewhat, given the topography, this lot is basically perhaps a natural drainage area for this
Those
excess
catch
water
basins
on
are
the roadway.
DIs?
They're DIs.
Oh, pardon?
Yeah, they're drop inlets, yeah. So they convey to somewhere else.
I'm unsure where they convey to, Mr. Rudlick, but they would discharge into one of the many ponds that are within the Ford's Colony subdivision.
Okay. It's an active drainage rather than simple infiltration.
I'm going to, we'll make those questions, see if the applicant's agent can address those. Any other questions of staff? Very good. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We'd like to open the public hearing. Would the applicant or his agent care to address the board? Mr. Roth, welcome.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Good to see you guys this evening. I'm Matt Roth, president of Roth Environmental, 700 Prescott Circle, Newport News, Virginia. I'm here tonight to present on 208 monofief for Omega Development and Mr. Marty Mather. The applicant is here this evening with us. He's going to stand up and say something after I do. Being last always means you have the most impacts in these board hearings. So when I was told that, I had a little smile because I knew this was another Ford's Colony lot that we've got that there's not much left on it once you put the RPA buffer on it to build. Again, we're half-acre lot in Ford's Colony. I've written down as many of your questions as I could scribble as you guys were talking about it. So when I'm done, please feel free to ask anything that I haven't addressed. The lot was platted in 2001. It's entirely forested. I believe the catch basin question is the road monofief. There are drop inlets along the road, so there's no water flowing onto the lot from the road. I think that might be what he was asking. Yes. All the water that comes onto this lot, basically, it's rainfall. There may be a little bit coming from the lot to the right. Oops. You were good right there. There may be a little bit coming this way onto the lot we would not be intercepting that with our catch basin. That would just continue to flow in its natural direction. The wetlands are all found down at the toe of the slope. If you can go to the site plan, please, maybe with the blue wetland line. That's good. There's a small little head cut right here. This is not a stream, but there was a drop in elevation of about 2 feet right in this area, which made for a nice little outfall spot without impacting wetlands. So that is the most southerly point of the wetland system that brings that RPA buffer onto the site. The major constraints on this lot, as far as development go, the 10-foot building setback limits became kind of null and void. They really weren't affecting where we could build the house on this lot. It was the 30-foot building setback off the road and then the RPA buffer coming from the north. The 30-foot building setback limit, it parallels the cul-de-sac. We're right at the beginning of where the cul-de-sac flares out. So in this part of the lot, we're basically where the tip of the garage is here. We're right on that building setback that it parallels the road. As we get to this corner here, it starts to follow that radius of the cul-de-sac, and the other building setback limit is right on this point of the house. So if we were to shift it, and we've twisted and turned and done what we could on this to see if we could come up with a smaller footprint for the house, but in moving it to the left, we basically increased the encroachment into the seaward portion of the buffer. And so we were trying to stay as much as we could in that landward section. We went with an L-shaped, basically house, so that you'd come in and go into the driveway, I guess as a lot of the Ford's Colony lots do, not straight in from the road, but they come in basically perpendicular to the road. And so we were able to get the garage here, so it pulled it close on that portion of the building setback limit here, and then just kind of brought the house around, so we clipped that edge right there for the building setback limit there. That was basically the best design we could come up with to keep the impacts as small as possible and in that 100-foot, or in the landward 50-foot portion of the buffer. The deck, we tried to line the deck up in line with the sunroom here on the back of the house so that we weren't encroaching any farther toward the wetlands or into the seaward portion of the buffer. And our total impervious area in the RPA buffer is 4,233 square feet, of which 3/4 of that is in this landward portion of the buffer, and then the 1,000 feet roughly in the seaward portion. Our mitigation plan, as this was a major encroachment into the buffer, we knew we had to go big on our mitigation plan. So we knew we needed to exceed the just recommended planting guide. So we did our 2 BMPs. We diverted stormwater around each side of the house. So we weren't trying to, we had explored putting in a single BMP in the back, so we weren't doing 2. And we, if we can get it into 1, that's great. If we were to do that, we would be basically compressing it immediately behind the house, which would mean you'd walk off your back patio and into your BMP. So we split them in 2, which worked out really well with our calculations and everything to bring this half of the site down this way to the larger one here, and then we've got another smaller one on this side. It's not going to have as much water going this way. The other components of our mitigation plan are the vegetative mitigation units. For the amount of impervious that we have in the buffer, the requirement was 10 units, and we're doing the equivalent of 12. Since we're already in a forested system and we're not trying to push our clearing limits out, but so far we went for heavy on the shrubs and only 4 canopy trees and 6 understory trees. It seemed to kind of work out the best, and we found that when you start trying to put too many canopy trees in those areas, they'll just end up overgrowing each other, and you have problems with your landscaping at that point, and you're cutting down your mitigation plantings. The other 2 components of our mitigation, we're doing the 3 inches of gravel under the deck to slow any runoff that comes through the deck, and then also enrollment in the Turf Love program. And I answered, could we build to the left? Catch basins, I think I got. There's no water coming on the site from the street. And, could you go to the mitigation plan that shows the green around it? Keep going, next slide, I think it is. There it is. As with almost all of our proposed plans and our mitigation, we're trying to load heavily with the plants around the perimeter of the clearing limits to try to make sure all of that is stabilized and you get able to catch the nutrients as they're coming down before they are released into the natural environment.
Any questions of Mr. Roth? Mr. Gusman, Mr. Lukens?
Nope.
Thank you, Mr. Roth, for your response.
Did I answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Do you have a operations and maintenance checklist or plan for these structures once it's turned over to an owner?
We use the DEQ required plan for it. I mean, I get it from the engineer, and I don't know if there's an actual schedule that they're supposed to do. I think there is.
I just know that, once these become part of a private property, then
yes,
out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
And sometimes people just don't know.
And that may be a good thing for us to offer and staff to maybe require as part of these small BMPs, because you're right. Once they're built, unless a staff of 2 or maybe we send the inspectors out, if you're not checking them every so often, they just kind of go by the wayside, or they don't function as they're proposed. That's one of the reasons we try to go with larger BMPs if we can combine it. In this case, it just would have taken up all the room right behind the house, because the larger ones are easy to maintain and to check than the smaller.
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Would anybody else care to address the board?
Hi, I'm Marty Mather. I just want to say thank you for the consideration of this. I've been in front of the board before, and you've been very, very helpful on everything that we've done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate you coming. Would anybody else care to address the board? Hearing none, I will close the public hearing. The matter is open for board discussion.
It looks very complete to me, sir.
Mr. Roth tends to do a pretty good job of thinking through our concerns ahead of time. I appreciate the addition of BMPs to a private lot. I would suggest that staff consider some type of O&M plan for these in the future, so that at least property owners understand what their responsibilities are. Do we have a motion?
Motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception for Chesapeake Bay Board Case CBPA 21-0047 at 208 monofief.
We have a motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception.
Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Gusman?
Yes.
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Very good. That is the last of our public hearings. We do have a matter for board consideration, CBPA 19-0037.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Before you is an extension request for CBPA 19-0037, 499 Jolly Pond Road, otherwise known as Deer Lake Estates in the Colonial Heritage Subdivision. Mr. Ryan Stevenson of AES Engineers, on behalf of Colonial Heritage, is requesting a one-year extension to CBPA 19-0037. Construction of this project will not begin before the exception expires. Staff does concur with the request, with the stipulation that all permit conditions except for the expiration date be reauthorized. This is the second extension request for this project. I'd be happy to answer any questions the board may have.
Any questions for Mr. Wilson?
I don't have any, no, sir.
I have a motion.
I'd like to make a motion, Mr. Chairman, that the board vote to adopt CBPA 19-0037, 499 Jolly Pond Road sanitary sewer.
We have a motion to adopt the resolution to extend the exception.
Yes, Mr. O'Brien?
Yes.
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson? Mr. Gussman?
Yes.
Mr. Lukens?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Very good, thank you. We have a May 12th Ches Bay meeting is scheduled. Any matters of special privilege? I'm seeing none.
I don't have anything.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn, sir.
We are adjourned.